Hello everyone and welcome back to the channel. Before we begin, I am giving away free samplers of my 3 psychological thrillers, 705, The Walk and Julia, and you can have them right now on the link on the description below. If you enjoy dark fiction, fractured minds, buried secrets, and stories that get under your skin, you can get them, as I said, on that description below. So click on it and claim them for absolutely free. Now let's get on with today's lesson. Most writers do not create weak villains because they lack imagination. They create weak villains because they mistake cruelty for power. A villain who kills, threatens, shouts, tortures, or explains their evil is not automatically frightening. That is surface behavior, noise, decoration. The truly unstoppable villain is not frightening because they are violent. They are frightening because they are structurally correct. They understand the protagonists better than the protagonists understand themselves. They know where the wound is. They know which belief will break first. And most importantly, they do not need to win every scene. They only need to make the protagonist worse. Today I'm going to give you a blueprint for creating an unstoppable villain in a psychological thriller. Not a bigger villain, not a louder villain, not a villain with a tragic childhood stapled onto them in chapter 20 so the reader feels sorry for them. We are talking about an unstoppable villain. The kind of antagonist who does not merely oppose the protagonist but expose them. The kind of villain whose presence changes the moral temperature of the story. The kind of villain whose presence changes the moral temperature of the story. The kind who makes the reader feel that, even if the protagonist survives, something essential has already been damaged. This blueprint is in 5 parts. Let's have a look at step 1. Give the villain a correct diagnosis. The first part of the blueprint is this. Your villain needs a correct diagnosis. This does not mean the villain is morally right. It means they have identified something true. A weak villain says, I want power. A stronger villain says, this world rewards the people who pretend not to want power. The second villain is more dangerous because there is truth inside the poison. In psychological thrillers, the antagonist should not feel like someone randomly inserted into the plot to create trouble. They should feel like the dark answer to a question the story has already been asking. If your novel is about guilt, the villain should understand guilt better than anyone else. If your novel is about repression, the villain should know exactly what everyone is refusing to say. If your novel is about identity, the villain should attack the protagonist's idea of who they are. The villain becomes unstoppable when the reader recognizes that their worldview is distorted, but not stupid. That is the key. A ridiculous villain can be defeated by reason. A correct villain cannot. Let's check step number 2. Make the villain attack the wound, not the body. The second part of the blueprint. Physical danger creates urgency. Psychological danger creates obsession. If the villain only threatens the protagonist's life, the reader asks, will they survive? That is useful. But if the villain threatens the protagonist's identity, memory, morality, sanity, reputation, family, guilt, or secret shame, the reader asks something far more powerful. What will be left of them if they do survive? That is the psychological thriller question. The best villains do not simply block the protagonist's path. They know which part of the protagonist cannot bear to be touched, and they press there. They do not say, I am going to destroy you. They say, you are not who you think you are. They also could say, everyone would hate you if they knew the truth. Also, they could say, you need me because I am the only one honest enough to see you clearly. This is the true threat, not death, exposure. Let's check step number 3. Give the villain control of the rules. An unstoppable villain controls the rule of engagement. This does not always mean they are rich, powerful, or physically dominant. In psychological fiction, control is often subtler than that. They control information, timing, access, what the protagonist believes is real. They control who gets believed. And also they control which version of events becomes official. This is why therapists, spouses, parents, police officers, doctors, teachers, employers, and charming friends make such an effective psychological thriller villains, not because of their job, but because they sit near systems of trust. The protagonist must need something from them. Validation, safety, forgiveness, proof, love, whatever may be. Once the villain controls something the protagonist needs, every conversation becomes a trap. The villain does not have to chase them. They only have to wait for the protagonist to come back. Let's check step number 4. Make the villain calm. The most frightening villains are often calm, not emotionless, not boring, but very calm. A calm villain suggests confidence. They do not need to perform danger because they already know where the pressure points are. They do not need to shout because they are not trying to convince themselves. This is where many writers lose power. They make the villain dramatic too early, too theatrical, too obviously evil. The moment the villain starts behaving like a villain, the reader relaxes because the story has become easier to categorize. But a villain who stays polite is harder to escape. A villain who speaks gently while destroying someone is harder to dismiss. A villain who appears reasonable forces the reader into discomfort because the reader has to work harder to locate the threat. That is the territory where psychological tension lives. The reader should not think, this person is evil. Not immediately. The reader should think, something about this person is wrong, but I cannot prove it yet. That, my friends, is much more powerful. Let's check step number 5. Let the villain win before the ending. This fifth path of the blueprint is evidence. If you want an unstoppable villain, they must win before the climax. Not always win, not threaten to win, just win. They must permanently damage something. A relationship, a reputation, a memory, a witness, a safe place. This is how you teach the reader that the villain's power is real. A villain who only talks about what they can do is not frightening. A villain who has already done something irreversible changes the reader's nervous system. From that point onward, every scene carries proof. The reader knows the story is not bluffing. And this is crucial. The victory should not be random cruelty. It should be thematically precise. If your story is about trust, the villain should make trust impossible. If your story is about guilt, the villain should make innocence look guilty. If your story is about memory, the villain should make the protagonist doubt the one memory they were using as an anchor. The villain's wins should teach the reader how the story hunts people. The villain's win should teach the reader how the story hurts people. Let's check this final test. Take your villain and ask 5 questions. Do they understand something true about the protagonist's world? Do they attack the protagonist's deepest wound, not just their psychological safety? Do they control at least one rule, system, relationship, or piece of information the protagonist needs? Can they remain calm under pressure? Have they already caused damage that cannot be completely undone? If the answer is no, you may not have a villain yet. You may have an obstacle, and an obstacle can be overcome. A true psychological thriller villain should feel worse than an obstacle. They should feel like a diagnosis the protagonist has been avoiding. By the time the reader reaches the final act, the villain should not feel like someone who entered the protagonist's life. They should feel like someone who was always waiting inside the life the protagonist had already built. So your prescription is simple. Do not make your villain louder. Make them more accurate. Give them a world view with truth inside it. Give them access to the protagonist's wound. Give them control over something the protagonist needs. Keep them calm. Let them do irreversible damage before the ending. That is how you create a villain who does not merely threaten the protagonist. That is how you create a villain who changes the shape of the story. And that is the difference between a villain readers dislike and a villain readers remember. So there you have it. Please like, comment, and subscribe if you found this episode helpful, and I will see you in the next weekly upload, my friends. Until then, take great care.